Good evening and welcome to the Granada Forum. Tonight we have as our guest speaker John W. Spring. Mr. Spring is a highly regarded authority and consultant on issues of global strategy as relates to matters of foreign policy and national security. Since the fall of 1960, he has advised numerous American presidents and administrations and federal agencies, directors, as well as U.S. senators and congressmen in regards to the direction they should take. His analytical reports and recommendations and solutions have brought him letters of commendation from many quarters, including the Pentagon and the State Department. About his background, after receiving an MBA, a master's degree, from the California State University of Fullerton, which is a local citizen here, in 1975, he began teaching college courses in geography and geophysics. His primary interest is strategy or generalship, which is defined as a science and art of military command employed with the object of meeting the enemy under conditions advantageous to one's force, in other words, to his position. An effective strategist considers all elements mastering geography, methodology, and physical, cultural, political, economic, and military disciplines. This is Mr. Spring's forte, or his strength. The title of his program is Global Strategy, Preparing for Our Common Defense. The focus will be on China and other nations of the Far East and Western Pacific. We think you will find this most informative, and we'd like to have a warm Granada Forum welcome to Mr. John Spring.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to say, first of all, that I have been very active in international relations, foreign affairs, and national security for nearly 4 decades. And considering the fact that I've just turned 60, I started out rather young in this particular area. So young, in fact, that some people might question my credibility. However, when you stop to think about what has happened during the last 40 years and the fact that if I had shared some of these things with you even a decade ago, my life could have been in jeopardy, you begin to appreciate what I've been through. It has not been an easy life. I've paid a high price for it. There are some negative ramifications which have occurred to me and my family because of my involvement. But we have put our nation first, and we're thankful to be alive at this time. Before I go on any further, I would like to read a short writing that my wife wrote recently. And when she presented this to me, tears came to her eyes. It goes like this. This is the title, My Beloved America. My beloved America, where have you gone? I've searched for you from sea to sea, and you were gone. I should have taken better care of you, and now you are gone. What is the answer? Or where is the answer? Return to God. This is written by my wife, Mary. It's not meant to be a poem, but rather a wake-up call. And I think if you interpret it as a warning, there is still time, but folks, we need to get busy. And I was hoping maybe the room would be completely filled, but I look at it this way. I'm interested more in quality than I am in quantity. And each of you here, I have a feeling before this evening is over, will be informed of a lot of situations which currently have been kept away from you by the media, to to some extent by our government. And I hope that by the time we are through this evening that you will have a better perspective as to some of our real concerns. I thought this evening that I would dedicate this presentation to a person who was, very familiar with this part of the world. He was born in, I believe, Little Rock, Arkansas, and in my opinion, he should have been nominated as Man of the Century, if not perhaps Man of the Millennium. The person I'm speaking of is General Douglas MacArthur. Now, many of us Americans are not aware of this, but he was highly respected throughout most of Asia, a population much larger than that of the United States. He commanded the respect. And yet, when he was fired by our President Harry S. Truman, a lot of shame was placed upon him, and a lot of tragedy occurred afterwards, especially in the battlefields. Is the sound system coming through pretty well? I feel like we're getting a little bit of feedback, and that always concerns me a little bit, but... Okay. Are we picking up pretty well right now? Okay, I just want to make sure about that. The reason that I have this map of Russia on the screen at the moment is due to the fact that within the former Soviet Union and currently now within Russia, geography and world strategy have been given a very high priority. It's been a very prestigious science, a science which has commanded not only prestige but respect of the entire nation. In Russia today, it is more difficult to become a geographer than it is to become a physician, to become an attorney, a screenwriter, a playwright, or actor. Because at Moscow State University, on the upper echelons or the highest floors of the most towering building on campus is the geography department. Now I have with me here a book called Who's Who in Russia and the CIS Republics, CIS standing for the Commonwealth of Independent States. I looked through this entire book. I came across many physicians, many actors, many diplomats, but I came across only one geographer. However, that geographer was the #1 advisor, or the key advisor to the President of Russia. Now, it's important that you understand a little bit about geography, because here in this nation of ours, we think of geography in terms of trivia. If you know the capitals and the nations of the world, possibly some of the islands, that's all geography seems to be for many of us. But geography has another side to it. It gets into the strategy, the information that you need for making war as well as peace, as well as building up very adequate defenses. Now, I mentioned earlier that during the past 40 years, I have been very active in advising administrations, including presidents of the United States. And I've taken my work extremely serious as a private citizen in this respect, in this regard. But it's very difficult to impress upon you what I've been dealing against. I have been competing with my adversaries, my counterparts within the former Soviet Union and Russia and other Marxist nations such as the People's Republic of China, North Korea, Cuba, who also have staff of geographers who are very competent in their fields. And they're working out strategies. And so far I've had a very successful track record because I've had excellent training. It's ironic that I'm speaking here in Tarzana, And one of your former residents, Dr. Joseph Spencer, former professor of geography at UCLA, was perhaps the world's greatest expert on China and the Far East. And I recall seated with him at the last geographical conference that we both attended together, and we had some young PhDs giving their presentations, and I could hear him chuckle, and I sort of did also about some of the information they put forth. So what I'm trying to get across to you folks, this is an area that I take very seriously. Many of the reasons that you have been able to continue with your work during the last 40 years has been due in part to the humble role that I've been able to play as a private but very effective citizen. Here is Moscow. Here is the vast Russian Republic. And you can see the smaller nations which compose the other Commonwealth of Independent States of the former Soviet Union. But you can see that Russia is the main nation. And as I said earlier, they do indeed have a staff of geographers, and their most competent geographers are the advisors to the president himself. This is a vast area for them to administrate, to supervise, and keep in mind that geography deals with external affairs. It deals with their military strategy. So I just put those on the screen. Having done that, let me introduce you to the world itself. But there's one question I would like to throw out at you right now, and I think you could probably answer it fairly easily because of the fact that you're here tonight. But most of you could be asked this question, and you could pose it to other friends of yours later on. What do you really value the most? Would it be a high-performance automobile, a private aircraft, perhaps a yacht that could go from here to Hawaii? Would it be a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, possibly real estate property for investment, rare gold coins, diamonds, jewelry? Perhaps some of these things would be valued most by your friends. But I think in your case, and I'm guessing here, that it would be your loved ones. Now, there might be some people that say, well, more than anything else, you would cherish freedom. But freedom makes it possible for you to enjoy your loved ones and for your loved ones to be safe and secure. So, some might argue it's freedom, but I think human nature says, perhaps for many of us, it would be our loved ones and their future. It might be a husband, it might be a wife, it might be a son, it might be a daughter, it might be a grandchild, it might be a niece or a nephew, or maybe just a good neighbor or friend down the street. And this is something that we need to be aware of. And that's why I'm sure all of you are here tonight, because you are concerned about your loved ones. And tonight I'm going to be sharing some things with you which initially might seem rather cut and dry. But as we get deeper into the subject, I think you're going to see that perhaps what I'm talking about tonight may be far more important than Y2K or any other topic that has been brought to your meeting within the last few years. Now, I could be wrong. It's possible that what I'm talking about could be of even greater importance than what you're going to be hearing this coming Saturday. At least I'm taking my role very seriously here, and I hope you're listening very carefully, as I'm sure you are. So let me begin with just a little bit of the cut and dry material, and then get into my main topic, which is East Asia and the Far East and the Pacific area. When you look at each of these maps, since they do deal with the world at the beginning, if you could just focus in on this area of East Asia and the Pacific area with respect to the rest of the world. And if you do this, you will begin to perhaps focus on an area of the world which you are least familiar with. Most of us are far more familiar with North America and Europe than we are with the Far East. So just look at these. The areas which are green would be areas of lower elevation. Those which are more of a yellowish or a beige color would be much higher in elevation. And perhaps the shaded relief can even give you some clue as to the mountainous areas. These are the main regions of the world or realms as some people might wish to define them. In my talk tonight, I am more or less including the Pacific world with the eastern portion of what is known here as the Orient. I'm combining these two with my main area of focus in my speech tonight. I am excluding South Asia and the Middle East and most of the former Soviet Union, with the exception of the far east of Russia right now. Although I wish not to get too technical tonight, I feel that this is one thing that you need to become aware of because it could be so important, and I'm going to be referring to this concept later on this evening. Here we have a subtropical anticyclone high pressure area, and it's relatively within this area that we have the prevailing westerlies from approximately 20 degrees north to 40 degrees north, with a few minor variations. Further south, of course, we have the trade winds closer to the equator, and this is mirrored also in the southern hemisphere. But for most of North America, Europe, Eurasia, and also the area that I'm going to be addressing tonight, for the most part, the prevailing westerlies, which blow from west to eastward, are a very significant factor which I will be alluding to later on. The climates for Asia and the Pacific area are of some interest. Here you see a good share of the Pacific area, which is shown as red. This would indicate monsoonal and tropical rainforests, and also along the area of Southeast Asia and southern China you find the same. In East China we find sort of a salmon pink color, which refers to humid continental climates, which generally receive most of their precipitation or rainfall during the summer months, and this area coincides with a good share of their agricultural activity as well. As we go farther north or more poleward, we get into much harsher continental climates, subarctic climates, which can be extremely cold. Perhaps of lesser concern at the moment, these are world soils. The A indicates alluvial soils, which are generally found near major rivers and streams, and generally quite fertile. And we can see throughout most of eastern mainland Asia, there's a lot of alluvial soils to be found, as well as some other marginally good quality soils. This is very important, of course, for truck farming and various types of grains. For example, in China, in the southern half of China, it's mainly rice. In the northern half, predominantly millet and wheat. This is a generalized map showing landforms. And we can see in the case of East Asia, we have the highest and most rugged mountains to be found anywhere in the world. These mountains play an interesting role both in terms of blocking either warm or cold air from a given area, or keeping moist air out of an area. So, for example, in the interior here of China, you have very arid regions or deserts. Along the coast here, for example, the North Plain of China, we have relatively good farmland, as we alluded to earlier. And you can see some other areas in Southeast Asia and some of the adjoining islands which have relatively rugged topography and a few small areas of plains as well. World population. I think you will notice that there is a very high concentration both in South Asia and East Asia, predominantly in China and some of its closest neighbors. Extremely high population densities, extremely large populations, China having more than approximately 1.3 billion people right now, which is a pretty large population. India, by the way, is catching up. It's just outside of our area of study for tonight, but you should be aware that it's rather large. Indonesia, which is now in the news with East Timor, is the fourth most populous nation in the world. So you can see that we have a very high population concentration in this part of the world. Some other things of importance. Here we have petroleum. And these are some of the spots, not all, but some of the major spots throughout the world where petroleum is currently found and extracted. This particular map shows concentrations of coal, and we can see, for example, that North China is well endowed with coal, as is Northeast China and some of the other nearby regions as well. Now, this is a different type of map projection, but this shows primarily areas of steel fabrication throughout the world. North America, both the U.S. and Canada. There are some others in Mexico, of course, of smaller magnitude. We find in Europe, for example, the Ukraine and the former Soviet Union. Here we find a little bit in India, in Jamshedpur, for example. And in North China, there are two areas, one major area of steel fabrication. And even on the offshore island of Taiwan, there's a little bit of steel fabrication. But also South Korea and Japan have steel fabrication. Now, getting into the Orient itself, the area which I am primarily defining for tonight's talk includes Eastern China, North and South Korea, Japan, the Russian Far East, Southeast Asia, which includes Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, I prefer to call it Burma still, Malaysia, which includes former Malaya and former Sabah and Sarawak of North Borneo, the island state of Singapore, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, over here to the eastern portion of that island, and the Republic of the Philippines, as well as several small islands found throughout the Pacific, as well as Australia and New Zealand, which are not shown on this particular map. As I mentioned earlier, the topography of East Asia and its neighbors offshore in the Pacific area have some of the most rugged and highest topography in the world. And you can see on this map also some of the rivers which flow throughout the area. The longest river in Asia is the Jiangqiang, which most of us know as the Yangtze, and it's navigable inland as far as approximately 1,000 miles. But the Yangtze is being engineered for hydroelectric activity and power stations, so that navigation in the future will be somewhat limited. Now, within China proper along the coast, there is a Grand Canal which is being renovated currently, which is also of some significance for bulk transportation. But perhaps of even greater importance is the area of the South China Sea itself. And the reason that I'm starting to talk now about water transportation is that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm about to share with you what may very well be the most significant and earth-shaking event of the forthcoming century. And it may take place within a matter of years, if not sooner. The People's Republic of China, as you know, has currently been given Hong Kong. In the month of December of this year, the Portuguese port of Macau will also be turned over to China. But mainland China, or the People's Republic of China, has its eyes on Taiwan. From their perspective, Taiwan must be returned to the motherland. And this is a most disturbing fact, or it should be for most of us here. Now, some of you might say, well, there are many goods that we buy in the store from Taiwan that are junk, just like the items that we buy from mainland China. But just imagine for a moment what might happen if indeed the People's Republic of China does take control of Taiwan. Have you stopped to think about this possibility? The Chinese certainly have, and I know their outstanding key geographers have as well. You must understand one thing. Whatever you lose becomes an asset for your adversary. And once your adversary has control of that asset, your strength becomes weakened somewhat. In terms of measuring your strength to survive, you have to assess how important such an area is and whether or not you can really afford to be without it. And even if it doesn't seem as if it may be of considerable value to you, would it be of even greater value to your adversary? And in the case of Taiwan, I'm afraid that we may find out, if we're not careful, that Taiwan will be of even greater value to our adversary than it has been to us. We have practically sold out Taiwan in many respects. You may recall years ago that it represented the Republic of China. It had a vote on the Security Council of the UN. It was one of the major powers at the end of the Second World War. It was one of our closest allies. And it seems as if every step of the way we did nothing but stab this nation in the back, which even supported the French and the British with their invested interests in Suez back in 1957. And yet the British and the French did everything they could to recognize mainland China. But in spite of the fact that many of its former allies turned away from it, it has tried to remain as pro-West as it possibly can. From a business point of view, it has become very prosperous. The standard of living has gone up considerably, and so has the democratic form of government to be found on that island. It is no longer the regimented Chiang Kai-shek regime. It is a very democratic type of government that's taking place in the free market. And of course, it doesn't always get the most favorable press that it should be getting, but that's the truth. Now, there are some islands that belong to Taiwan, which some of us old folks might have referred to as Formosa years ago, which are very close to the mainland. These are the islands groups of Quemoy and Matsu. How close are these islands to the mainland? Well, would you believe possibly 5 to 7 miles? Close enough that swimmers from mainland China have been sent on secret missions to these islands and given a medication so that if they do not return by a certain time, they will die. And many of the people that went on these secret missions wanted to defect. The doctors, in some cases, were unsuccessful. But I just mention this because I want you to be aware as to how close in proximity these islands are to mainland China. And as you know, in the past, they've been shelled on almost a daily basis. And one could almost figure out the time of day by the shelling taking place from the mainland. Now, with everything that you're hearing about China, you're probably saying, what does this really have to do with what I'm hearing about in the news? Earlier, I started to allude to some sea lanes, some water transportation. I would like to get back to that now for just a few moments, because water transportation is important to many of these nations. It is important to Japan. It is important to South Korea. It is important to Taiwan. And it is also important to Singapore. In fact, without goods coming into and leaving these nations of East Asia, they would not be able to survive for any great length of time because they have relatively few resources of their own. They have very few raw materials, and they have only a limited amount of food that they can produce. Just for example, in the case of Singapore, for example, it would be almost comparable like living on the island of Manhattan in New York City. Imagine if the Hudson River bridges and tunnels were destroyed, or the East River bridges were destroyed. I don't think that that town would be able to be very viable for any great length of time without food coming into that area. And the same is true not only of Singapore, but also for Taiwan, and to perhaps a lesser extent for Japan and also South Korea. You may not be aware of this, but the Strait of Malacca is one of the few sea passages from which goods can go to and from the Pacific Ocean by way of the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, and conversely. It is a very congested area. For several hours at one period of time, traffic is allowed to flow in one direction, and then after the ships leave that area, then several hours later, the traffic is allowed to go in the opposite direction. The ships are in such close proximity to one another that you can see the smoke from your neighboring ships as you pass through. It's very congested. Now, currently, China has placed air bases and naval stations on the Parcel Islands and the Spratly Islands. They do not show up on this particular map, but the Spratly Islands are as far south as the tip of Vietnam, more than 800 miles away from the closest point of mainland China. The Parcel Islands, which have also become an oil reserve for mainland China, are located off the coast of Vietnam at about the same latitude as Hue, for those of you that are familiar with Vietnam. And those two air and naval bases constructed by the Chinese in the South China Sea could jeopardize navigation not only for Taiwan, but for Japan, Korea, and Singapore. And in addition to those particular areas, there are some other areas of Southeast Asia and East Asia and the Pacific area that we have also neglected. For example, it was not so long ago that we had U.S. naval and military as well as air bases in the Philippines. For several years now, after the government of Manila asked us to leave, we have not had any bases in the Philippines. At one time, the British may have had a few bases here in North Borneo. To the best of my knowledge, they do not. Now, if the People's Republic of China were able to control the west coast or the northwest coast of Borneo and perhaps portions of the Philippines, they would have almost complete control of the South China Sea. If this were to come about, this would devastate practically all water transportation through this entire area. And this is where practically 90% of all ships going to and from North America and to the Indian Ocean travel. Again, you're probably saying, why is he talking about something that we know nothing about? Well, because it's something that you need to learn something about. It may sound a little cut and dry now because it hasn't been hyped up in the news and you haven't heard it on any of the talk shows to any great extent. But this particular area of the world is very dependent upon maritime transportation. And if the People's Republic of China is able to gain control of this area, they can in fact control practically all of East Asia and the Pacific area. Imagine not just losing Taiwan, but imagine also losing the Philippine Islands, South Korea, and Japan. Impossible, you say. If I, as an outsider, can study such a region without privy to the information available at Beijing in their military agency planning area, Just imagine for a moment what they are planning. Now, granted, I'm very concerned about the possibility that there are many missiles currently based off of East Asia aimed towards Taiwan. These are relatively short-range missiles which could cause great damage to Taiwan. In addition to that, I don't know if you're aware of this, but mainland China has purchased several diesel-electric submarines. And unlike nuclear submarines, which they have also purchased a few, the diesel-electric submarine, very similar to the submarines which you were never told about used by the Russians during the time of the so-called situation in Central America, in which we had Corinto, about the size of San Diego Bay, being used by the Russians for their diesel-electric submarines to patrol up and down the Pacific coast here, are very quiet. They may be shorter in range, but because they are quiet and silent, and they do not emit warm water, which can be detected by satellites, they do not necessarily need to patrol the Formosa Straits. They could just as easily patrol the eastern coast of Taiwan, completely surround Taiwan in that manner. But knowing the Chinese, I don't think their first option is to attack or destroy something which they would very much like to have within their possession. If anything, they will use it as a tool or a means of causing Taiwan to return to the motherland. But personally, I don't think it's going to be necessary for them to even threaten Taiwan with one single missile. Because if China is able to successfully seal off the South China Sea so that no goods or materials can reach Taiwan, within a matter of days, once they are able to complete such a blockade, there will be little need for a shot to be fired if they can place Taiwan completely under siege. That is, of course, assuming that the United States cannot come to the assistance of Taiwan. Something perhaps further down the road, you might say, but on the other hand, something that you must start now to give a little attention to. I have here a more detailed map showing China. Here, of course, is the Yangtze River, or the Changjiang. And here is the Sichuan, or the Red Basin, which many people refer to as the Rice Bowl. And this is the transportation, which is navigable for approximately 1,000 miles upstream or inland towards the interior. Here you have the Grand Canal that I was alluding to earlier. Here we have the Strait of Formosa, and here we have the South China Sea. If we just think that Taiwan is the only area in jeopardy, let's see what's just a few hundred miles south of Taiwan. Here we have the island of Luzon, the largest island of the Philippines. And everything that should come under the control of the People's Republic of China brings about one more asset for them. Here's a map which shows Southeast Asia. And here are a few of the main rivers, such as the Irrawaddy, the Salween, and the Mekong. These are important as waterways as well. And as I said earlier, here is the Malacca Strait, which you can see with a little bit more detail. And this is one of the three main ways that you can enter into the South China Sea or into the Pacific Ocean from the Indian Ocean. And most people prefer to navigate their ships through the Strait of Malacca. And as we said earlier, the Spratly Islands are situated just about right here. They don't even show up on this map. And the Parso Islands are situated about right here off the coast of Vietnam. And those areas are currently Chinese naval and air bases. And of course, here is Taiwan. And what I alluded to earlier is if this area of Malaysia and possibly this portion of the Philippines, through wars of insurgency or guerrilla warfare, should come under the control of China, then they would have almost complete control of this area. Now you might say, well, we don't hear anything on the news about this, and I don't think you're going to find any news, because this work is being done very slowly, very gradually, and once it goes into operation, it will be given a very low profile. And if this should come about, then Taiwan can become almost completely at the mercy of mainland China, as might be the case also for some of our other allies, such as China, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. This is just a map of Southeast Asia so that you may recall what I was referring to earlier. The Parso Islands are situated just off the coast of Hue, and as I said, just over here to the right, east of Vietnam, at about the same latitude as the southernmost tip of Vietnam, are the Spratly Islands. Islands so small that you will not find them even in some of the better atlases. And Singapore, which is really a island, city-state, or nation, is another area that would be very vulnerable to such a situation. Here we have Japan and Korea, and these, of course, are our key allies right now. Japan is one of the most highly industrialized nations now in the world, and despite its economic setback recently, it has a tremendous capacity to produce high-quality goods. They have some very advanced technological research that's currently going on. And here we have South Korea, and here we have North Korea. Now, as all of you are well aware, North Korea also has missiles. And we'll get back to China's missiles in just a moment. But with the assistance from China and perhaps Russia indirectly, North Korea now has the capacity to send short-range missiles that can hit Japan with nuclear warheads. So if North Korea were to decide right now to invade South Korea And if we were to come to South Korea's aid, we must also consider the possibility that North Korea could bomb Tokyo and some of the other highly populated cities of Japan. To make this situation even more complex, we believe that North Korea now has the capacity to send at least some missiles with nuclear warheads across the Pacific, capable of hitting some of our cities here on the West Coast. So this is an area that I think you need to be aware of. Now this is an interesting map showing some of the territory once occupied by Japan. Some of you who are historians might recall that during the Russo-Japanese War at the turn of the century, which was later mediated by Theodore Roosevelt, our president, that Japan briefly occupied most of Russia's Far East and eastern Siberia. But Russia is an area that you need to be concerned with in two directions. It could become a victim or an aggressor within this region. Much of the land which it currently has under its control is disputed land which China and even Japan have some claims to, as well as Korea. Now, historically speaking, Japan has controlled Manchuria, and when it controlled Manchuria, it developed a very highly sophisticated industrial infrastructure, which became an asset to the People's Republic of China when they proclaimed their independence in 1949. This was the area, of course, which MacArthur was considered bombing, and for that reason, some people in Washington thought perhaps he was mad. But considering the fact that this was China's only industrial area of any significance, perhaps you can appreciate why he was considering that as an option. Japan also occupied various portions of China during the Second World War. It has had Formosa or Taiwan under its control up until the end of the Second World War, and there Japan built a very impressive infrastructure which the Chinese of General Chiang Kai-shek were able to appreciate once they fled from mainland China to Taiwan, consisting of highways, railways, and bridges and power stations. Also, at the end of, I should say, the beginning of the First World War, Japan became an ally of ours and the British and the French, and as a result, at the end of the war, it was awarded these islands of the Pacific as a mandate of the League of Nations. And up until the end of the Second World War, Japan had control of these islands, which were up until recently administered by the United States. And our U.S. Department of Interior turned practically all of them into welfare states, which was rather unfortunate. They completely lost their dignity and the strong work ethic which the Japanese had provided to them. Now, the reason that I'm bringing these to your attention now is that these areas of Micronesia, in many cases, could provide alternative air and naval bases for the United States in the event we might not be able to have access to some of these areas in the not too distant future if things don't go exactly the way we expect. Or, if we continue to ignore these areas, they could become bases in the future for the People's Republic of China. Remember, something that may not seem to be of great value to you might be looked upon as a far greater asset by your adversaries. So this is one reason why I hope you don't ignore the various political entities of Micronesia. Here's another map which shows some of those same areas in perhaps a little greater detail. Of the transparencies which I'm going to show you, unless I decide to repeat some of the ones that I had up on the map earlier, here is one of the Western Hemisphere. This is the only one I could find, in all honesty, but I want to call something to your attention which is also quite crucial. The Panama Canal. The Panama Canal Zone and the Republic of Panama. Within a few short months from now, on December 31st at 12 noon, the United States is going to officially relinquish all control of its air, naval, military bases, the canal zone, all of the infrastructure which it once owned and built, to the Panamanian government. Although we expect that there were several bribes in the various bids that were taken for which company would control these locks and facilities of the Panama Canal itself, the Panamanian government decided to give a bid to a Hong Kong company, which is in reality controlled by the People's Republic of China. So as of the end of this year, the Chinese will have control of the Panama Canal. They will control also the ports at either end of the canal, as well as a series of other ports which they currently are maintaining for various nations throughout the world. Now, some of you have heard George Putnam. I commend him for saying this. A few weeks ago, he said, once the Chinese are operating the canal, they could deploy intermediate range missiles which would be capable of hitting most areas of North America. They might be able to accomplish what the former Soviet Union was able to do in Cuba in 1962, or during the Reagan administration in Central America, namely Nicaragua, during the years approximately 82 through 86. That is another secret that's been very well kept from the American public, but Russia had the capacity to deploy such weaponry within a relatively short period of time of days, if not weeks at the most. And this was the main reason for the building of such long airfields on Grenada and in Nicaragua itself, because they needed airfields long enough that would land the largest air transport that the Soviets had at that particular time. Large enough to deploy an entire unit, which would include not only the nuclear warhead, but the rocket and the guidance system itself for such a weapon. And that was one of the best kept secrets from the American public. Unfortunately, the Chinese might be able to succeed where Russia failed in Cuba and Nicaragua. This is an area which has always been vulnerable for the United States, because We have never developed a warning system, and because of the close proximity, it would be just a matter of minutes after liftoff that such a weapon would enter United States territory, and actually be far more accurate than any ICBM coming from Russia, North Korea, or mainland China. Let's go back to China for just a moment, because China does pose some other problems for us that we need to certainly be aware of. China has, for many years, been one of our most active adversaries. Since the Second World War, it's one of the few nations besides North Korea, which I can certainly remember as being an enemy of the United States. In fact, I advised the Nixon administration that it was a very bad idea for President Nixon to visit China unless we were actually going to gain something from that visit. To the best of my knowledge, we have not really gained much in the way of anything except the fact that now we have at least a dozen intermediate range missiles with nuclear warheads and at least another dozen intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads capable of hitting any city within the United States of any significance. And this was almost given away by either lax security or deliberately by the U.S. government in some shape or form. If anything, it appears that the Cox report seemed to play down the complete seriousness of this whole event, because now China has modifications on its long-range or a long-march missile, which is their ICBM, with its improved guidance system, is now capable of hitting any place in the United States. And in addition, we have given them the technology to make their nuclear warhead far more compact, much smaller and lighter in size, so that it could be deployed on a much smaller rocket or missile than it was in the past. So we've just made things so much easier for the Chinese. And the thing that we need to emphasize with respect to North Korea and China, we have no defense system against a first strike, just as we have no defense system against a first strike from Russia. If that is not bad enough, there are some other factors that you need to consider. You will recall very early in the presentation I mentioned the prevailing westerlies. The prevailing westerlies, which are essentially at the same latitude as most of China proper, as well as North America and Europe, for that matter, are to China and North Korea's advantage. Now, some of you who lived during the time of the Second World War may recall that there were newspaper warnings about small balloon bombs being released from Japanese submarines off our shores at nighttime. And there were some people that did not heed those warnings that were killed and maimed or wounded by those bombs. I know of one case down by San Juan Capistrano on a small ranch. where several people were killed, lost their lives. And it was not big news. It was more of a harassment or terrorist tactic designed to weaken our morale. But at the same time, it was a very effective weapon. Some of you who may go by some of these car lots nowadays may see these similar type round balloons, which remind me of these very much, but that's another story. Today there are two other products on the world scene that you need to be aware of. One set of these are biological, the other set are chemical. Now, anthrax is the biological weapon which we need to become aware of because, again, we have no defense for our civilian population. It can be airborne, and it will go basically in the same direction that the wind will take it. And in the case of China, if China were to deploy this from off our shores, it could make a negative impact on the population of several of our cities. Because even a small amount, once it becomes airborne, is dispersed very rapidly. The other item, of course, is chemical warfare, and there are types of nerve gases which were developed by the United States and by the Germans during the Second World War and later utilized by the Russians and actually used in the Middle East by such governments as Iraq against the Kurds, for example. And unless you have your civilian population armed with gas masks designed to protect them against such chemical reagents, which we commonly refer to as gases. They're not actually true gases. They're very fine aerosol type of reagents which generally destroy the respiratory system so you can no longer breathe and hence you die. And we need to be aware of the fact that these weapons could be used, and although we have not deployed such weaponry, we made a point during the Second World War of training our military population and to some extent even our civilian population on how to defend themselves against such type of warfare. But currently very little is being done because, again, it seems like it's a relatively low priority. In closing, I would like to say this. Many of us are worried about Y2K. Y2K has actually occurred in many instances throughout America. It's not well publicized, but many corporations have found out that their computers have gone down and they've had to stop functioning for a couple of weeks while their computers are put back in working condition. And that's why maybe you've questioned a bill recently which you've paid, and you wonder why a few weeks later you're getting an invoice saying, or a statement saying you haven't paid that bill. And this is going to continue. And there may be times that we actually do have a power outage. And I do realize there's always the possibility that someone who wanted to take control of our government and tighten the reins might even create some situations so that power could go down. So I definitely encourage all of you to become prepared and self-sufficient. But at the same time, what I've been talking about this evening, I've been talking about in a relatively low-key manner. It takes a great deal to get me really upset. But what I'm trying to say is, I believe what I'm sharing with you tonight is of far greater concern than Y2K. And the irony is, we still might have a chance to do something about this situation. Just imagine for a moment, what would happen if we were to take the initiative and say, well, you know, those islands off the coast of China do have some strategic value for the Chinese. Now, seemingly for us, perhaps they do not have any great value. But do we really want those to be occupied by mainland China? Because once they do that, then they're going to be able to put some of our allies into submission without firing a single shot. Do we really want that? But we're so focused on the possibility of a nuclear strike that it seems right now Congress is ready to placate China. Have you noticed that even the Republican leadership recently has been taking the approach, well, we better not be too stern towards China. We better consider the possibility that they should enter WTO, the World Trade Organization. Otherwise, they might become a little bit angry towards us and start to release some of their missiles. Of course, China knows that we have more missiles than they do. Even if they were to carry off a first strike, such an attempt would be far more damaging to them, and they know it. But they hope that we are so scared of an attack from them that we will bow over backwards, or bend over backwards, I should say, so that we will more or less give them whatever they want. Just as recently we gave them most favored nation status, but they called it normalization with China. Semantics. Now, I was disappointed to find out that your Congressman James Rogan voted for that, just as Congressman Dreyer did. I was surprised that Loretta Sanchez voted against it, as did Chris Cox and Dana Rohrabacher, yes. And I'm sure Ed Royce also voted against it. But down the coast, I believe it was Packard voted for most favored nation status. And I wonder where some of these people are coming from. Perhaps they have not spent 40 years studying this area, because what I'm sharing with you is the major area of the world which I've tried to specialize in. Now, from time to time, I've found myself on other assignments such as Latin America, the Middle East, and Russia, or the former Soviet Union. But my main area of expertise and study has been the Far East, Eastern Asia, and the Pacific area, because 40 years ago, these were areas which were ignored by most Americans, and I thought they were very interesting areas. Let me just share a few things with you about myself. When I was a youngster, about the age of 13 or 14, I was corresponding with pen pals throughout most of Asia. India, Malaya, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, for example. I enlisted in the Coast Guard, and after completing basic training on the East Coast, during my military furlough, I visited the UN Security Council, and before being seated, one of the staff members boasted to me on how they were going to solve our Alaskan situation. Back in 1957, Alaska was not a state. It was a territory of the U.S. The United Nations had other ideas in store for Alaska other than statehood. But fortunately, Alaska became our 49th state. But visiting the U.S. Senate was another surprise. It seemed that I just came at a very interesting moment. Senators were still holding sessions on what went wrong in Hungary during the Hungarian revolt in Budapest. And if I had time, they would have invited me into some of those subcommittee meetings. But during the main session of the U.S. Senate, just a few days after President Diem of South Vietnam had visited with President Eisenhower, and all of the senators had attended a Rose Garden ceremony, it was amazing that senators from both sides of the aisle, such as our prominent Republican Everett Dirksen and Mike Mansfield, and of course Vice President Nixon was presiding over the U.S. Senate. The way these people spoke and the way other senators spoke was shocking. Just in the manner in which they spoke about these areas, I could tell they knew nothing about Southeast Asia. They had very little in the way of a clue where South Vietnam was, and they didn't have the slightest idea what Diem's policies were. But nevertheless, they more or less gave Diem carte blanche, whatever he wanted. The United States made a commitment, carte blanche, which we stood by as long as we could, until some of these senators found out that they weren't doing too well in the popularity ratings, and so they changed their mind, and we sold out South Vietnam. But the problem is that tragedy could have been averted if they had only taken the time to study what they were getting into in the first place. But they made their decisions in haste. And it was from that time on that I realized, as little as I knew, just basically a high school graduate, that these guys needed all the help they could get. And so, shortly thereafter, when I was in college and I was a pre-med student, I realized that there were some other things of even greater importance, such as Cuba. And during the Eisenhower administration, I studied charts which had in Spanish on them Bahia de los Conchinos, which you now know as Bay of Pigs. This was one of the areas that we had proposed that might be considered as a landing spot, but that's another story. But later with JFK, shortly after the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion, I suggested that he consider a blockade, a naval blockade of Cuba. I found out several decades later that he actually received my letter, had read it, made some notations, sent it to State for further study. And fortunately, they followed through with studying it because this dealt with matters related to international law. Shortly after the Berlin Wall was built by the Russians, my wife and I were doing our laundry at a laundromat just off campus. And it turned out that the owner of that laundromat was a recently retired Army colonel who had been an intelligence officer. And he said to me, out of curiosity, "John, why do you think the Berlin Wall was built?" I said, "Well, according to what I read in the newspapers, it's to prevent all those freedom-loving Germans in the East from reaching the West." And so he sort of chuckled and laughed, and he said, "Well, you are aware of the fact that they already have minefields, they have guard towers, and barbed wire fences, which do a fairly good job of discouraging people from fleeing to the West." And he said, "John, the reason that the Russians decided to build the Berlin Wall was because West Berlin has been our main listening post to the east. And any couriers or agents of ours in the east and in Russia which have key documents that need to get to us generally send those documents by themselves into West Berlin. And the Russians knew this. And they wanted to prevent this from occurring. Well, this posed another question for me. What could be so secretive? What type of operation could be going on within the Soviet Union that would require such an expensive wall to be built? Well, as I had been receiving several newsletters from an organization known as the DRE, a Cuban exile organization based in Miami, Florida, I came across one short paragraph on the back page of one of their newsletters. And it simply said, large quantities of cement are being unloaded at Port Mariel from Soviet vessels by Russian personnel onto Russian trucks manned by Russian drivers and taken to a remote location which is even restricted from Cuban military personnel. Well, I got hold of the best charts and maps I could find of the area. And as it turned out, this area was woodland, fairly rugged in topography. And I concluded, obviously, that it could not be used for an airfield, and it was not going to be used for any altruistic purposes. So I asked a friend of the family who had some understanding of Soviet weaponry, and I tried to get an idea what class of weapons could be deployed from such an area that would require large quantities of concrete for an infrastructure of some type. And the only logical answer was the Soviet not intercontinental, but intermediate ballistic missile. Their intermediate range ballistic missile, capable of carrying a nuclear warhead to a distance of 2,200 nautical miles, which is well within the range of most of the populated area of North America. Since I already had established some rapport through my earlier analytical reports with JFK, I was not aware of it at the time, but he did get my latest analytical reports about preparations for deploying intermediate range missiles with nuclear warheads. I also tried writing some letters to the U.S. senators representing the state of California. One of the letters I received from one of those senators was rather nasty and would have discouraged any light-skinned person, or thin-skinned person, I should say. And in mid-December of that year, a few months after the missile crisis, I received a letter from the White House with a brief note and signed by JFK. And a few days later, or weeks later, I received similar letters of commendation from the State Department and Department of Defense at the Pentagon. And what I'm trying to say is, sometimes we need to take the time to study some of these areas throughout the world. And I realize that all of us have various talents and gifts. For example, earlier this evening, some of you asked me questions about things which I probably know less than anyone in this room about. But I try to learn, as I would encourage you to try to learn more about what's happening. This is one group I don't have to lecture about being more concerned about America than Monday Night Football. Obviously, you are very dedicated people, and you're going to continue to be dedicated. But here is an area of the world right now which we are concerned about, but we're taking the completely wrong approach. We think that we can buy off China by simply providing them with more trade. We have a very large deficit already in trade with China, by the way. And the Panama Canal, and a few years back, you may recall, they said, if we come to the assistance of Taiwan, we're going to find out whether or not you Americans value Taiwan more than you do Los Angeles. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they have the capacity to do a little bit more damage than just bomb Los Angeles. They can hit practically any major populated area now within the United States. And you need to be aware of that. But at the same time, we need to have courage. But in addition to courage, we need to regain some of our moral fiber, which is so much lacking. We need to scrutinize every single political candidate, not just someone who looks good on the surface for a few moments and then turns out to vote for most favored nations status for China. We need to find out if these people who are going to be representing us in Congress or in the U.S. Senate know anything about the rest of the world. I can tell you that 90% of our U.S. senators know practically nothing about the rest of the world. Any of you in this room probably have already, even before I came this evening, a much greater in-depth background knowledge of the rest of the world than most of your senators. And they're making the decisions on international situations. I wish you could see them in session sometime. The only thing is, it's probably worse now than it was then back in 1957. Much worse. Because we don't have too many political giants like Mansfield and Dirksen in the U.S. Senate right now. Maybe Senator Helms and Imhoff and a few others, but not too many. And the same is true with our U.S. Congress. And regarding politics, what do we hear most of the talk about? Well, it's focused primarily on who's going to be our next presidential candidate. Well, that's fine and dandy. Or maybe it's Hillary running for the U.S. Senate in New York. But folks, here on the West Coast, we should be thinking about who's going to be representing us in the U.S. Senate, who's going to be representing us in Congress, and who might really be doing the best job if we really put our minds to it in the White House. Are we going to be controlled by the media? It seems that way. Are we going to believe everything that Rush Limbaugh says? I don't think you should believe completely what anyone has to say. You should make up your own minds, but the question is, you should make up your mind. Don't rely on someone else. It's just like when you took an exam in college, you wouldn't want to rely on someone else for taking the test or being evaluated for you. That would be fraud. But yet, in reality, that's what we're doing when it comes to electing our leaders in this nation. And there's other things we need to do. We need to find out what's being taught in our public schools and who's doing the teaching. I would be willing to guess that if you were to attend some even of the more prestigious high schools in this area, like Woodland Hills High or Pierce College or whatever it might be, you would be somewhat disappointed in terms of the curricula and how it's being taught. Are the people even aware of where these areas that I've alluded to this evening are located, or the significance of any of them? They're very important. When I was attending junior high, one of the current events I reported on was the fall of Dien Bien Phu. There were not too many Americans in those days of adult age that understood anything about Dien Bien Phu. But if a junior high school student can read the newspaper and analyze it, I don't see why adults can't either. And considering the fact I didn't have a college education or a high school education, it should be possible for most informed citizens. So I'm asking you to become more aware of these situations and take the time to voice your concerns. If you learn something tonight, share it with others. If there are not enough brochures on the back that I had gratis, I'll put some more out after the talk tonight. But I do want you folks to leave armed with some information. And other than that, again, I just say, what do you value the most? And I know that most of you value your loved ones and freedom. And I thank you for being here. You need that one.
Okay, we have any questions? Okay, can you answer some questions?
I'll be glad to take questions. I apologize for going on too late.
Can you hear me?
Very well.
I was wondering, why would China want to destroy and biologically destroy the United States? What good would the United States be good to China? And when it comes to shooting nuclear weapons, why can't they just put them on the submarines and send them over? I mean, it all depends on, I don't see where you're going with the lecture. If we leave China alone, they ought to leave us alone. And it can go both ways. I mean, what are we going to do? Make a first attack on China?
No.
Well, the thing is, if we're going to sell out to China, I mean, that's not us selling it out. That's our elected officials. But when it comes to them, for the United States Army to all of a sudden start controlling those islands there, you're going to have some big major conflict. And you better be ready for that first initial strike. Because, that's what it seems that you're discussing on, getting the United States active in the China Sea. I don't know, if they want to start throwing punches,
Okay.
Who wins?
You've raised some good points, and I want to emphasize the fact that I'm not advocating all-out war with China. On the contrary. In fact, you've brought up some very good points that I should have touched upon also. First of all, China is very much aware that the United States is the best economic market for them in the world. It is definitely going to be to their advantage to trade with us as long as they can. But one of the reasons that they want this economic trade is so that they in turn can use that money to invest in their military forces so that they can buy the highest state-of-the-art weaponry available on the world market. Now, for some reason, we are still looked upon as an adversary. I forgot to mention in my talk that China has a series of SEZs, special economic zones, which enable China to acquire technology and at the same time screen or control foreign personnel entering China, and at the same time train Chinese personnel in the state-of-the-art of manufacturing various products. Please understand this, that China will become only as aggressive as we allow it to be at this stage. And we've allowed them to be exceedingly aggressive by giving them away the highest state-of-the-art technology in terms of nuclear weaponry and missiles. What we've got to do now is look at the situation more realistically. China does not want to bomb or destroy the United States nor Taiwan if it can simply get its way. The same was true of Hitler. there were many nations who, if they just simply allowed Hitler to enter with his troops, would not have to fire one shot. They could capitulate. They could surrender. But before you ask that, I'm going to pose one question to the audience. Can you imagine anything whatsoever that is worse than war? Anything at all? Slavery. I've talked to Polish people who were in Soviet concentration camps. And fortunately, they were allowed to go into combat with the Allies. And that combat was exceedingly hazardous and deadly. Many of their comrades died. But at least then they had hope. When you're enslaved, you lose all hope. Now your question, sir.
What do you think Clinton's over there in New Zealand doing? What are they doing over there? Do you have any idea?
He is doing his best to placate the Chinese leaders. Just as the Republican leadership will in a few days be doing its best to also placate the Chinese and doing everything possible to get it into becoming a member of WTO, the World Trade Organization. Because basically they are very fearful of China. They're very fearful now of this first strike possibility, which could kill millions of Americans right now. But the Chinese are, I have to give them credit, they're basically fairly level-headed people. And they have a lot of patience, a lot more patience, I would say, than many Americans. You see, folks, you need to understand your adversaries. They would much rather try a conventional tactic as what I've laid out this evening. It may take them decades to accomplish it, but if they can cut off all the arteries and vessels, basically, of Taiwan's heart, eventually they're going to be able to control that island without firing a shot. Unless we have a little bit of leadership which understands that perhaps with some very relatively low-cost intervention on our part, we can monitor that area of the world without taking hostile actions towards the Chinese. I'm not asking for all-out war. What I'm asking for is monitoring, becoming aware of situations which I'm sure the Chinese right now are looking as alternatives towards all-out war.
Congress has to have the desire.
Very definitely. And they have to have the information. Now, I commend Dana Rohrabacher for going to the Panama Canal and the Spratly Islands and looking into these areas. There need to be more Americans looking into these areas as well. Very good question, sir.
Yeah, I want to thank you for your presentation tonight. I'm sure most of us agree with most of what you've said, and you've given us a lot of extra detail we probably didn't have before, and thanks for being there for our country in your capacity with your knowledge. I just would like to take a disagreement with you in your perception of these conflicts, of how they've come about. You're probably just the right age to remember a defense secretary named Forrestal. Does that ring a bell?
Well,
James Forrestal?
That's going back to my early childhood.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I wasn't born yet, but I've read about him, and he was what you might call an insider. He belonged to all the right organizations. He worked for Dillon Reed Bank, and he was well connected. But at some point in his life, he realized that this country was not working for the benefit of itself, let alone the rest of the world. It was working for an ideal or a goal that had nothing to do with American security and American welfare. And he broke from that cabal, and he stated at one time that in regards to the State Department, that stupidity or consistency is never a mark of stupidity. If people who were running the State Department were simply stupid, occasionally they would make a mistake in our favor, and they never did. All right, the point I'm getting at is that since before the middle of this century, probably into the 1920s, the United States has been the foremost helpmate of communism around the world. At every turn, we've fought it in several large and small wars, but we have never dealt it a death blow, which we could have done just merely by withholding our aid and our technology and our prestige from it. It would have crumbled. Yes. So when we talk about Russia being an adversary, China being an adversary, we gave the Soviet Union the A-bomb. That's been documented. We gave China the means to deliver nuclear weapons, okay, and they in turn got their nuclear know-how from the Soviets, etc. These aren't mistakes, and we have to ask, of course, why. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but in giving them the means to credibly threaten the United States, we've provided a credible enemy for the people of the United States to be afraid of and to have an entity to be against. For 50 years now in the case of the Soviet Union, and now China is evolving into the next credible enemy for the next century. That, I believe, is not a mistake. It was done, it was planned that way. It does two major things. It provides a reason for us to continually be in perpetual debt, to plan for wars and fight minor wars continually, and it also creates the conditions that are proper to meld the nations of the world into a world government. Therefore, I really appreciate what you're saying. I just want to put my nuance on this, that this has not been a haphazard tragedy. This has been planned, and it's going along according to plan. I don't know a whole lot of what to do about it. You touched on it, and that is getting involved with your representative in Congress, not even so much the senators. But the president, the position of president, has taken on enormous extra-constitutional powers, which has to be taken from him so he cannot act as a dictator anymore. It has to be brought back to our representatives in Congress. And yes, I appreciate what you're saying. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you very much. You brought up some very good points. I can't find much that I disagree with, actually, in what you've said. It's just that I couldn't cover everything tonight.
Yeah, thank you, especially bringing out the horrible threat China is. And as you know, since this country is so overpopulated, like half the world's population in that one country, and you have countries that are underpopulated that they would love to acquire land, like Australia and New Zealand, Canada. And with all this gun control they have in England and in Canada and in Australia, the only reason the Chinese aren't taking those countries over is because they know Big Brother, the United States, would come to their aid. So when you look at the overall situation, when they collect the guns in this country, if they ever do, the police officers would be doing the work that an invading Chinese army would do. It's like our country would be doing it for them. That's what I always mention about when they talk about gun control. You're surrendering to the enemy.
Yes.
So what do we have to do to wake up the American people that this threat is so great that if we give up our guns, and then the worst thing is when you go into a store, my wife was in a dress shop the other day, almost everything, about 90% of those clothes are all made in China.
Yes.
And I've always believed the definition of treason is aid and comfort to the enemy is treason. These people that sell Chinese goods are committing treason because they take that hard currency and they crank out weapons. And I understand they've been buying weapons from the Soviet Union. That's where a lot of their surplus goes. They have battleships, they have jet planes, helicopters, they've got everything. They've got a huge arsenal. And they're building them so fast with their in huge factories and all those workers, they can almost double it. If they can bomb 25 cities this year, maybe they can do 50 next year and 100 in 3 years. And I can't understand how people can sit around and watch the ball games or the football games when our country's being raped. People should be so excited in arms. I don't understand why this room isn't packed with 1,000 people, because we could be taken over by that country. And when they take us over, they've got allies. They've got North Korea, and they've got Vietnam, they've got Cuba, they'll have Iraq, Iran. Every country that hates the United States will join in. And people are just going around enjoying life like nothing's happening. To me, it's like seeing somebody get raped. You're going to stop it right away.
Yes.
And these traitors, like Rogan, and I don't call him a traitor because if he's for most favored nation status for China, the only reason that we're going to vote for him is because he will say we have to vote for the lesser of two evils because his opponent, Adam Schiff, is worse. So we never get anybody good because they take this attitude like Lundgren had, oh, I'm good on the other issues. I'm just not good on the gun issue, but I'm good on the other issues, so you got to vote for me because I'm not as bad as my opponent. What we're getting is a Republican treason party masquerading as two separate parties. When are we going to get our act together? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you'll stick around for just a moment for me to try to answer your question because...
Excuse me, I had a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. If I may just try to answer your question very quickly. First of all, Australia, despite its size, can only support a relatively small population. The United States looks far more like the promised land for the Chinese than Australia ever would from that perspective. I should also mention that in the very near future, within about 2 decades from now, India's population will exceed that of even China's. But getting back to the real guts of your question, if I may use that term, what are we really going to do about this? This is the difficult question. Well, first of all, I'm not a very good speaker. I'm not. But I try to do the best that I can. But part of the problem is, unless I have an audience, unless you tell people that I'm available, basically, I'm not going to be able to get this word out any more than any of the other fine speakers would about their particular concerns. But this concern motivates me night and day because it's just a matter of time before it will become reality. Now, I don't claim to have a crystal ball to predict the future, but I am able to prognosticate, and I've had a very good track record of being able to prognosticate on many of these situations. I'm generally about 10 years in advance of the actual situation. There still is hope, but you cannot wait 10 years to prepare for such a catastrophe as this, because the world is developing at a much more rapid rate in terms of technology. What we expected China would receive maybe a decade from now, they have now, for example. Now, our best intelligence estimates from the Pentagon, not me, but from the Pentagon and the CIA were supposedly they should have gotten this to this level 10 years from now. Now, personally, this has been a sacrifice to my wife, to me, because it's very difficult talking about these issues, especially when we're addressing deaf ears so many times. Everyone just wants to be happy for the moment, it seems like. They're enjoying these good times right now. Now, I personally hope that Y2K is not a serious situation, but I would advise all of you to prepare for it, because even if it doesn't come along, you're going to still have the advantage for earthquakes and other disasters which may come around in the near future. But getting back to the question, you need to look at things realistically in terms of politics. This is something that I hate to do. But you have to look at what your chances are. If you want to go out on a third party or off on another tangent, you can be heard, make a few waves. But in the long run, in order to get elected, in order to have some say in Washington, you're going to have to play politics. And you're going to have to work with some of these people maybe that you thoroughly are disappointed with in some instances, until you can come up with better candidates of your own. And all I can say is these are topics that you should not hear once a year or maybe every 6 months, but you should really have topics related to just this alone. I would say at least quarterly. Try to put committees together so that you can become effective, because that's going to be really your only insurance policy in the long run. I mean, how much is your home going to be worth if it's occupied by the Chinese government? How much are your savings bonds going to be worth? You've got to think of everything. Your jobs, your careers, everything, your families. That's why you came here tonight, and I thank you for that. And that's why you need to keep focused on this situation, because if you don't, we're going to pay a dear price.
Mr. Spring, I understood that you were going to be running for the U.S. Senate. Is that true?
I had, in the past, made 2 attempts to run for the U.S. Senate here in the state of California. But I doubt very seriously if any of you ever heard of me run as a candidate in the Republican primary for 2 major reasons. In 1992, I took a very strong stand against NAFTA. In fact, I was the only run. And also, I took a very strong stand against illegal immigration. I'm not anti-Hispanic. But because of those stands, my name was not majored in any of the major newspapers throughout the entire state of California, even though I ran a campaign throughout the entire state, until after the primary election, because they were opposed to any candidate who was against NAFTA and too much against illegal immigration. Now, I attempted to do this by myself. I attempted to self-finance myself, and at this stage of my life, I can no longer even do that. I can no longer even afford to come up with the money for a filing fee, which is probably about $3,000 now. However, in answering your question, if I could put together a committee, and they in turn would be willing to work in such a capacity, and it becomes feasible, then I would be willing to make such another attempt. I think in many respects it might be more feasible than it might have been in the 2 last attempts that I made, for several reasons. There are certain things going on within the national scene, politically speaking, which may enable a Republican to get elected here in the state of California, which has not been a possibility for several decades now. But I would need to have people that would be willing to do some of the paperwork. I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you, for example, raise $5,000, you've got to register a committee with the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. And the members of the committee have to file these reports quarterly. And if you don't, you're subject to, I think, imprisonment. So they're making it very tough on individuals to run a campaign. Now, the ideal thing is to win. However, there are some advantages on just being a candidate. You can bring issues like this to the attention of the American people, which you cannot do otherwise. And because you are a candidate, sometimes you have a capacity to address things to Washington while you are in that particular status, which can, like for example in the case of the LA riots, be to the advantage of the people of California in getting help in emergency situations like that. So please understand that's a possibility, and I realize time is going short, but the one advantage of becoming a candidate is that I could get some of these issues out to a larger body than I would by just giving lectures. On the other hand, if I were to actually win, at least you'd have someone in that Senate who knew something about what's happening in the rest of the world. That's the best I can do for an answer. If anyone's interested, you could pick up one of my cards or approach me after the meeting if we're out of cards in the back, and I'll supply you with some more material. Thank you for your question. Yes? It's just an idea.
Yeah. In considering these issues, with respect to China or Cuba or the recent Marxist takeover of Venezuela, you don't hear much about Marxism. We haven't since the fall of the Soviet Union. And I was wondering to what degree you think that they're continuing to adhere to the old Marxist-Leninist, Stalinist doctrine, or whether that's really kind of faded into the background even in the communist countries.
Unfortunately, Marxism is alive and well. I know President Clinton has told us that China is no longer a communist nation, but the Communist Party in China convinces me it still exists. The same is true even more so in North Korea, and it continues in Cuba, and to a lesser extent even in Russia. Russia is about one heartbeat away from again rekindling its communist ideology. And please understand that the Marxist-Leninist strategy is based on the type of strategy that I've shared with you this evening. I'm sorry, did I answer all?
Well, yes, in a way. I'm a former Marxist years ago. And there's so much in Marxist doctrine that you rarely hear about today. I mean, the international proletariat, the revolution of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, these things, yes. And the building of the new Soviet human being in preparation for the communist withering of the state, you hardly ever hear these concepts anymore, anywhere. So I was wondering if you thought that they were still alive.
Unfortunately, they are very much alive. They've sort of taken a back seat within the former Soviet Union, or what is now called Russia. But even there it can be rekindled. And it's an ideology that we still must deal with. As Lenin said years ago, play the capitalist game with them, and eventually you will be able to have them sell out their own freedom if you just give them enough time. Basically.
Well, they have won the cultural agenda pretty much.
Yes.
All of the various things that were to be achieved by the revolution have been achieved in a cultural and social sense in this country. I mean, the destruction of the middle-class family, free sex, these kind of things, and now the withering of our boundaries. All of these things are part of the communist Marxist agenda, but it's being sold to people as something that's going to bring world peace and prosperity, and they don't realize it's Marxist.
Yes.
Yeah.
About all that needs to be done now is to destroy the Second Amendment.
Yeah, that's true.
It's being sold as liberalism here.
Yes.
Yeah. Speaking in that vein, the Federal Reserve System, the income tax, and those are communist doctrines. Communism is money, is a mother of whores, Babylon. Anyhow, John, what do you think of Forbes for president?
Forbes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not humping for him. I'm just saying, what do you hear?
Well, Now, please understand, I don't have expertise, as much expertise as probably many people in this room regarding Steve Forbes. Did I say his name correctly? I apologize if I didn't. He's advocated, as one of my former worthy opponents in the Senate race years ago did, regarding a flat tax. I personally think if we need any type of taxation at all, it should be more of a consumer tax. Because if you have a consumer tax and it goes too high, the entire American population is going to revolt against it. But right now, when you have an Internal Revenue Service one step away from being Gestapo personnel, you need to be concerned. Another thing you need to be concerned about, as I think one of the gentlemen was alluding to earlier, is our Federal Reserve. It is foreign-controlled, and it was designed mainly to handicap or injure America's economy, thriving economy of free enterprise. And the profits do not go to the U.S. government, as many think, but rather to just a few very well-to-do families.
Do you think with North Korea gearing up on like red alert that they might attack South Korea and set this whole chain of events off?
It's possible. I know there are GRU defectors who seem to think so, but my guess is if they take that gamble, they can only do it once, and then they're toast. Now, they could bomb Tokyo, they could send a bomb over here, but I could almost guarantee the next day there's not going to be North Korea. And I think they know it. So this is the possibility. Now, if you have a madman who's determined to launch the missile, there's very little you can do about that first strike. But on the other hand, I think even those people are sane enough to realize that, yes, they can probably launch them, but they won't be having breakfast the next morning. Yes, sir.
John, I've witnessed other candidates being more or less frozen out of coverage by the liberal media, just as you were. And how can we go about getting some people with vertebra into Congress and Senate as opposed to the invertebrates that populate Capitol Hill now?
Okay. First of all, it seems like we have a whole generation now of people who never served their country in any military capacity. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only factor to look in a candidate, but that's one that comes to mind. For example, I went through basic training with a fellow by the name of Ted Turner. He was in the same company as I. So perhaps that does not make him the best presidential candidate for the United States just because he served his country, as I have. But on the other hand, I would look at other factors too. What a person has tried to do as a private citizen, how he's tried to serve his community. I think so often we get onto this concept that in order to serve at a higher office, we must be first a member of a school board or member of a city council or a board of supervisors of the county before, or at least run for the state assembly before being considered to run for a federal office. Personally, I think those credentials themselves do not bring out the best qualities for a candidate for a federal office. So what I'm saying is you have to look at the total person. Maybe that person's disabled physically. Maybe he's not an all-out athlete. But at the same time, you've got to consider all qualities of that individual and how that person's going to act once he gets in Congress. Is his head going to grow so large that he's not going to be able to come and visit your town again? because the streets aren't wide enough for him to drive by with his large head in the convertible? Or is he going to still be humble enough to realize that you folks put him in office, or her in office, whatever the case may be?
We have about 2
Just want to
minutes
say
left.
quickly that Turner giving $1 billion to the UN would disqualify him in my book.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry to say that in 1913 we passed the 16th Amendment, which gave the money changers control of our country.
Yes.
We have helped Cuba and put Castro in power,
Yes.
and honored him in New York, and we have done nothing but help the communists grow in every country. When is America going to wake up and save our great nation under God again? Thank you.
America has to wake up, as you've alluded to. These are not things that have happened overnight. Most communist ideology is the work of ancient senior citizens, but it's continued on because it's gotten into our bureaucracy, unfortunately.
Okay, John, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.